Hi everyone, we seem to have a lot of success with the introduction for chapters 5 and 6, so I thought I'd do the same thing for you this week with chapters 7 and 8. Chapter 7 is somewhat unique in my particular book because it didn't exist 20 or 30 years ago as a chapter. This material would have been covered in the Romantic era or in the early 20th century, and the truth is it very much bridges the gap, and that's why I chose to sort of compile it all here in one place. So we're going to go from the late 1800s well into the 1900s in some cases here, but the music belongs kind of grouped together, so that's what I've done. We start with a style called Impressionism, which centers around a guy named Claude Debussy. Now, as you'll read in the book, Debussy absolutely hated the term Impressionism. He wanted to be called a symbolist, but we call it Impressionism, so there it is. Again, you've got the classic FM links. Check those out. Those are all pretty cool. And there's my man Debussy. You've got some great music from him. And then the guy that comes right after him is Maurice Ravel. Now, Ravel is often actually referred to as a post-impressionistic composer because he starts with Impressionism, but he goes so much further. He does a lot of different things, and as you discover his music, you'll hear some great stuff. In particular, beyond what we have in this class, I recommend the Concerto for the Left Hand. It was written for a guy named Paul Wittgenstein. After World War I, dude lost his right hand in the war, and so he commissioned Ravel and others to write pieces for the solo piano with orchestra, left hand only, and the one Ravel wrote is pretty epic. There's a new style of opera coming around. It's called Verismo opera. There's some arguments about what is and what is not Verismo. The big example you have here is Puccini, which some people say is actually not Verismo opera, but trust me, it is. And he's a cool dude, and you have Madame Butterfly here. There's, of course, tons of Madame Butterfly performances on the internet. You can watch the whole show. It's pretty cool. I have a historic recording here of Madame Butterfly. It's really beautifully done. Recommend it to you highly. And then we go into what are called the post-romantics. People who were heavily influenced, by and large, by Wagner, and they are beginning to break down tonality. Wagner starts, as you saw in chapter 6, by delaying cadence points, by adding more chromaticism. And people like Mahler and Strauss and others continue that until we get to chapter 8, and we're going to adopt an entirely new system, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Mahler is epic, and there's absolutely no way I can cover him completely in a class like this. Mahler symphonies are an hour to an hour and 45 minutes long. Bring a snack. They are absolutely worth it. Some of the most awesome symphonic music written. He, of course, breaks the barrier between instrumental and vocal music. His second symphony, his third symphony, his eighth symphony all have choirs and solo vocalists, just like Beethoven's Symphony No. 9. He was a really cool dude. Also one of the first people, like Dvorak back in chapter 6, to come and spend a lot of time in America. Mahler came and conducted in America what we would think of as the New York City Opera, the Metropolitan Opera. It was a predecessor of that, but that's what he did. You got links to some cool movies there. His wife was quite the piece of work. You want to check her out. Bride of the Wind is a pretty good fictionalized account, but it tells a pretty good story of her life. Anton Bruckner, kind of like Mahler, little more stodgy, if you will. Is that a word? Yeah. But interesting stuff. And he also wrote some glorious sacred vocal music as well. Pretty cool. Sibelius, nationalism continues, and he bridges that gap nicely. And again, look at his dates. You know, he lives so long. He fits into this post-romantic category. A lot of film score composers steal from Sibelius. Richard Strauss, here's a guy who was decidedly romantic in nature, but bridges that gap again into the 20th century. And again, look at how long he lived. He starts as an instrumental composer and then branches out into opera and revolutionizes opera on several fronts. Salome, probably his greatest opera. Elektra's pretty awesome too. And then he starts writing more mannered, what we call neoclassical operas. A lot of good information about him. And then finally I have Sergei Rachmaninoff here. Rachmaninoff is a Russian. Again, post-romantic, but really post-romantic just because, look at the dates. He lives almost halfway into the 20th century. His music is decidedly Russian and decidedly romantic in nature. Some of the most beautiful melodies you'll ever hear, and you have one of the greatest. The Russian Orthodox Church evolved slightly differently from the Catholic Church. The liturgy is very similar, but it's just different enough that it sounds Russian. It's like when you're watching a great spy movie and the Russians are around the corner. How do you know? The music tells you. Well, the way that works is we've studied back in chapter 2 and 3 Gregorian chant and how that evolved in music. Well, the Russians had something called the Znameny chant. It's not in the book. It's a totally different thing, except it's not. It's actually very similar, but it's just different enough that it sounds, if you will, Russian. And the Russians have a great history of sacred liturgical music that is written for the Russian Orthodox Church. And again, it parallels Catholicism in many ways. It's just different enough. And you have his setting of the Ave Maria from the Vespers, the overnight service. The Russian Vesper service is one of the most moving services in Russian Orthodox music, and tons of Russian composers wrote great Vesper services. This is one movement from one piece. It's awesome. And then you got two British composers, Edward Elgar and Gustav Holst. I really should have Ralph Vaughan Williams here too, and I think when I redo this book again, I'm going to add Vaughan Williams right here. Edward Elgar was kind of the first important British composer in 300 years, since Purcell, really, 200 years, since Purcell. And he kind of brings a standing back to English classical music, if you will. He has disciples, Holst I mentioned, and the other guy is Ralph Vaughan Williams. Both of these guys wrote brilliant symphonic works. They wrote brilliant works for wind band, which was a new thing back then, so they're pretty important for that. And they were fascinated by British, Irish, Scottish folk music, and they began incorporating that into their compositions. So you have a big set of nationalistic goals with these guys as well. So some pretty cool stuff there. Pardon the zipping. Let me scoot ahead to chapter 8. And as we move fully into the 20th century, wait for it, there we go. As we move fully into the 20th century, what you're going to see now is fragmentation. Composers more than ever are searching for individual voices, individual sounds, individual styles. And often they'll explore a number of different styles as they go through their life. Now, Beethoven had an early, a middle, and a late style period. Mozart has an early, a middle, and a late style period. So does Haydn. So do a lot of the other composers of the Romantic era. Basically, their music remains pretty similar. Here, when we say 3 style periods, man, we're talking about wildly different stuff in some cases. For example, the first guy in the chapter, Igor Stravinsky. Stravinsky, very much a disciple of the Russian composers, people like Rimsky-Korsakov, Tchaikovsky, but also the Impressionists. Here's a young Stravinsky with Debussy. Stravinsky's Russian, but he makes his first mark in Paris, writing for the Ballet Russe, Sergei Diaghilev. And those pieces, those ballets, Firebird, Petrushka, and the one in our books, The Rite of Spring, were groundbreaking in many ways. They are Russian nationalist in nature, but they're also sometimes what are called primitive in nature, primitivism, particularly The Rite of Spring, because of the story. And he explored new rhythms, new harmonies, complexity on a level we'd never seen before. So much so that by the time we got to The Rite of Spring, it actually led to a literal riot at the premiere, and you can read all about that. I don't want to spoil the story for you. But later on, he changes direction and he writes neoclassical stuff where he pares down the orchestra, he pares down the chamber groups. He goes back to writing more strict formal structures. He uses different harmonic structures as well. And then he changes again and he starts writing 12-tone music, serial music, which we'll get to in just a moment. But those are 3 pretty wildly different styles. So over the course of his life, he tried a lot of different things. Following Stravinsky is Bela Bartok. Bartok's one of my favorite composers for the 20th century. Absolutely fascinating guy. He's probably best noted for a piece called Concerto for Orchestra. Let's think about that term for a minute. Concerto, as you learned in chapter 5, a work for solo instrument with orchestral accompaniment. That's not what this is. This is different. This is acknowledging that the level of playing over the last 150, 200 years has gotten so good that every member of the orchestra is trained and qualified to be a solo player. Everybody has that skill now. And so he writes a piece that prominently features, one after the other, every player in the orchestra, every section in the orchestra. It's fascinating work. You have another work from him, a little nationalistic in nature because he was a great ethnomusicologist, collected a lot of folk tunes. This is music for strings, percussion, and celesta. You have the last movement. Is absolutely It's a whirling dervish. It's a really cool piece. You also have a nice kind of sub-story here about Leonard Bernstein and his experiences conducting in Budapest, which is really very cool. So you can read about that. Prokofiev, here again, Russians who were nationalist in nature at times, but also more modern moving forward. Again, embracing multiple styles as they go through their careers. Prokofiev leaves Russia, comes back, versus Shostakovich, who stayed in Russia. And you can read about the trials and tribulations of being a composer under the Soviet regime. In particular, you can read about his early works, which made Stalin crazy. Stalin hated him. Threats were made against Shostakovich. He responded with his Fifth Symphony, which supposedly had good Russian ideals, but some say had hidden messages, so you can read all about that. This link to this film about Shostakovich, absolutely fantastic. You have the Chamber Symphony, which was taken from one of his string quartets. It was adapted for string quartet to a full string orchestra. I encourage you to try different versions of it because it's a fantastic piece of music. It tells the story of post-World War II and the firebombing of Dresden. Really interesting piece of music. Paul Hindemith is here because here again, here's a composer who comes and spends a lot of time in America, revolutionized his composition for the wind band. This is the only wind band composition that we'll study this semester, and it's a pretty good one. It's the last movement of his Symphony in B flat. Remember the fugue in Chapter 4 by Bach? Well, here's a modern fugue as Hindemith uses it. Interesting dude. And then we get to Charles Ives. Nothing I can say or do will prepare you for Charles Ives. Just brace yourselves. Read all about it. This Charles Ives Society website is absolutely fascinating. It's worth your time to poke around. You have a long memos essay by Charles Ives. It's taken from one of his books. It's very much stream of consciousness kind of writing, and it is of its day. So, take everything in the historical context that it's presented. This was written almost 100 years ago. But it's an interesting excerpt. And then we get to probably the most famous American composer from the 20th century, Aaron Copland. Now here again, Copland's early music, very dissonant and harsh. His middle period, that's the Americana stuff. That's Fanfare for the Common Man. That's Rodeo. That's Billy the Kid, the Americana stuff. You have Rodeo in your books. But then his third style period, Surrealism, 12-tone music, what we talked about with Stravinsky and what we're about to talk about with Arnold Schoenberg. All right, I did also stick Gershwin in here. I don't spend a lot of time with him, but absolutely go discover his music. It's fantastic. Okay, here's another very important focus on form. This deals with the artistic movement, Expressionism, which makes its way into music. It deals with the breakdown of tonality to the point where Arnold Schoenberg said, hey, we've weakened tonality so much, let's just be done with it. So he began to intentionally write freely atonal music. That ultimately proved kind of unsatisfactory, so he made another change and devised a whole new mathematical system called serialism. And serialism is accompanied by a number of techniques, Klangfarben melody, Sprechstimme. You can read all about these. Here are the basic rules. Here's a wonderful matrix of how we organize the notes. This is my old composer buddy, Sam Holloman. Let me have this. This is a matrix he created. And then you have a second article. This is actually a lecture that's been transcribed into English by one of Schoenberg's disciples, Anton Webern. Webern is really actually a funny dude, and people don't realize it when they hear his music. But he really was. And there is humor in this, and you just sort of have to read it with that dry sense of German humor translated into English, which makes it even harder. Here's a really good YouTube link that will describe the 12-tone system in more detail, much like what I did in the Focus of Form that I just went by. But read this with care. It'll help you understand their goals and what they were trying to do. And I think the most important thing I want to stress to you is this music may sound insane and crazy to you, but for them, it was the next logical musical step. It made sense. And these guys all came from a romantic perspective. They came from a romantic background. But they embraced Expressionism. They embraced these new ideas of extreme, what we would call extreme dissonance. And they came up with a new system that revolutionized music forever. A lot of people hated it, but it changed the world. You have Pierrot Lunaire, which is a freely atonal work. And then you have Survivor from Warsaw, which I think is one of the most powerful serialized 12-tone works of all time. Read the story. Make sure you understand it good before you listen to it. It deals with the aftermath of World War II. And then Webern, his students, you've got his symphony. This, again, is a freely atonal work, but it deals with Klangfarben melody using pointillistic melodies. And his technique, which is totally different. And then finally Berg, who's the most romantic of the three. And you have links to Wozzeck and Lulu, his two operas. You have Wozzeck here, absolute masterpiece. It's a lot to dive